When we hear the word Panzer, the German armored forces of World War II, we often picture perfect, cold, and invincible war machines. But history tells a different story. The evolution of German tanks was, in reality, a journey filled with paradoxes and obsession, starting from light tanks as fragile as toys and ending with massive steel monsters weighing 188 tons that were virtually useless on the battlefield. So, what turned an army that prioritized speed into one enslaved by gigantic size? Where does engineering genius end, and where does delusional madness begin in today's video? Let Behind the Weapons help you decode the files of 7 iconic tanks. We won't just look at dry statistics. We will dive deep into the fatal flaws and the untold stories of the soldiers inside those steel shells. Panzer I, the tank that went to war without knowing it was a tank. Would you believe that the machine kick-starting mechanized warfare was ironically nicknamed the Krupp sports car by its own crew? Why? Because it was fast, sure, but it felt incredibly unsafe, as if the soldiers were sitting in a fragile metal box, completely exposed on the open battlefield. Just look at the technical specifications. It was armed only with 2 light MG-13 machine guns, effective against infantry, but virtually useless against armored vehicles. Even more concerning was the protection. Armor plating that maxed out at just 13 millimeters. However, to be fair, the Panzer I was not entirely useless. During the Polish campaign in 1939, it served as the numerical backbone. Its speed and mobility allowed Germany to successfully execute Blitzkrieg tactics. But that glory was short-lived. By the invasion of France in 1940, when encountering heavy tanks, the Panzer I was rendered completely impotent. It could only bully the weak, but was hopelessly outmatched by equal opponents. Furthermore, a critical weakness lay in its structural design. The rear engine ventilation grills and the front vision ports became its Achilles heel. Opponents quickly realized that heavy weaponry wasn't always necessary. A precisely thrown incendiary device targeting the ventilation or concentrated fire on the vision slits could instantly immobilize the vehicle. Behind those failures lies the immense psychological pressure on the crew. Obergefreiter Karl Müller of the 4th Panzer Division, fighting in the suburbs of Warsaw in 1939, later recalled that haunting experience. Every time we heard an impact on the hull, we held our breath. We knew that this 13mm steel was there more for morale than for actual protection. So what was the fate of the Panzer version when it became obsolete? The Germans wasted nothing. Realizing the Panzer I was too weak for direct combat, they withdrew it from frontline tank duties and transformed it into a diligent pack horse. Thousands had their turrets removed to serve as ammunition carriers, armored ambulances, or were mounted with the first heavy anti-tank guns, Panzerjäger III. From a weakling stand-in, it quietly retreated to the rear, becoming an indispensable support vehicle until the very end of the war. Panzer II, the great stopgap or a makeshift patch? If the Panzer I was a driver training car, then the Panzer II was Germany's hasty stopgap solution. While waiting for the production of true main battle tanks, the German army needed something that could fight immediately. Thus, the Panzer II was born, a reluctant stand-in that ironically became the backbone of the armored forces in the early stages of the war. In terms of specs, it was a significant step up from its predecessor. Instead of harmless machine guns, the Panzer II was equipped with a 20mm autocannon. This weapon was powerful enough to neutralize trucks, light armored vehicles, and effectively suppress enemy infantry. It was actually the Panzer II that spearheaded the deep penetrations of the Blitzkrieg tactics in Poland and France. However, this stand-in had a fatal operational weakness: the commander's overload. Due to the cramped turret design, the commander had to juggle too many roles at once: observing the battlefield, directing the driver, and personally loading and firing the gun. In the chaos of combat, forcing one man to do the work of three significantly slowed down the vehicle's reaction time, making it a vulnerable target. This helplessness was most evident when facing heavy opponents. Lieutenant Hans Weber of the 7th Panzer Division, the Ghost Division, described the terrifying experience during the Battle of Arras in France, 1940. "We fired magazine after magazine at that iron beast," the British Matilda tank. But it was useless. The 20mm rounds bounced off their armor like pebbles thrown against a stone wall. The feeling at that moment wasn't fear. It was complete despair. So, what was the fate of the Panzer II when its thin armor and 20mm gun became obsolete? The German army didn't scrap them. Realizing the chassis was incredibly reliable and durable, they removed the weak turret and mounted massive anti-tank guns or artillery pieces on top. The Panzer II was reborn under new names like the Marder II, tank destroyer, or the Wespe, self-propelled artillery. From a weakling stopgap, it transformed to serve the German army until the very last day of the war. Panzer 38e, the outstanding outsider. Here is an interesting paradox few people know. At the time Nazi Germany invaded France, the best, most reliable tank in their lineup was not made by Germans. It was the Panzer 38T, a war prize seized from the Czechoslovak army. The T here doesn't stand for ton, but for Czechish, Czech. In terms of performance, it completely outperformed the domestic Panzer Schim and Berbergrün. It boasted a highly accurate 37mm gun and an engine so durable it was astonishing. While German tanks frequently broke down during long marches, the Panzer 38T kept pushing forward. It was these imported vehicles that were the true spearhead, allowing Rommel to pierce French defenses in record time. However, this foreign star carried a fatal design flaw: riveted armor. Unlike German tanks, which used welded construction, the steel plates of the 38T were held together by rivets. This created a horrific danger. When the tank was hit, even if the enemy round didn't penetrate the armor, the sheer kinetic shock would cause the rivets on the inside to shear off and fly around the cabin like shrapnel. Many crews suffered severe casualties caused by their own tank's rivets, not the enemy shell itself. Sergeant Franz Meyer of the legendary 7th Panzer Division shared this fear during the Russian campaign in 1941. "We loved this tank because the engine never died on us. But every time we heard a shell explode outside, everyone flinched and covered their faces. We were terrified that the bolts behind our backs would turn into bullets." So, what was the fate of this outsider? When it could no longer face Soviet T-34s, the Germans still couldn't bear to scrap it. They realized the Czech chassis was too good to waste. So they removed the old turret, cast a new modern sloped hull, and mounted a heavy gun. The result was the birth of the Jagdpanzer 38T. Hetzer, one of the most effective and feared tank destroyers of World War II, serving faithfully until the very last minute. Panzer III, the brain of the battlefield. If Panzer I and II were the warm-up act, Panzer III was the heart of the Blitzkrieg doctrine. This was Germany's first main battle tank specifically designed for tank versus tank combat. In terms of specs, the Panzer III didn't have the thickest armor or the biggest gun, but it possessed a secret weapon that allowed it to defeat far superior opponents: the three-man turret. While French and Soviet tanks of the time burdened a single commander with everything, commanding, loading, and aiming, the Panzer III divided the labor clearly: a commander to direct, a gunner to aim, and a loader to handle ammunition. This machine-like coordination, combined with modern radio systems in every vehicle, allowed Panzer III units to outmaneuver and outthink enemies that were technically stronger. However, this brain was held back by weak muscles. The fatal weakness of the early Panzer III variants was their lack of firepower. The main 37mm gun, and later the short 50mm, quickly became useless against monsters like the Soviet T-34 or KV-1. Furthermore, the turret ring was designed too small, meaning engineers physically couldn't upgrade it with a significantly larger gun. It hit a development dead end way too early. This firepower impotence became a nightmare on the Eastern Front. Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Türk of the 3rd Panzer Division recorded his helplessness when encountering a KV-1 tank in Russia, 1941. "We engaged that monster at a range of only 50 meters. I ordered rapid fire at its tracks and turret, but all we got, in return, was a mocking knock, knock sound as our shells bounced off. The infantry started calling our gun the Army's door knocker, because it politely knocked, but could never break the house down." So, what was the fate of the Panzer III when it could no longer fight other tanks? Once again, German ingenuity shined. They completely removed the cramped turret and mounted a large gun directly into the hull to create the Stug E3 assault gun series. Ironically, this recycled version, the Stug E3, became the most produced German armored vehicle and destroyed more enemy tanks than legends like the Tiger or Panther combined. Sturmpanzer IV, Brummbär, the urban nightmare. After the bitter defeat at Stalingrad, the Germans learned a costly lesson. Conventional tanks were useless amidst the tight rubble of city ruins. They needed something more brutal, a demolition machine that could blow away an entire building with a single shot to clear the way for infantry. And thus, the Brummbär, Grizzly Bear, was born. Essentially, it was a Panzer IV chassis fitted with a massive armored casemate housing a short-barreled 150mm howitzer. Its power was terrifying. A single high-explosive shell from the Brummbär contained enough explosive filler to collapse a 3-story building, burying any resistance inside. Its frontal armor, 100mm thick, made it a mobile fortress, impervious to most handheld anti-tank weapons of the time. However, the Grizzly Bear suffered from a fatal weakness: blindness and overweight. Cramming such a massive gun and thick armor onto an old chassis made the vehicle incredibly top-heavy, frequently causing transmission failures when climbing slopes. More dangerously, the early versions lacked defensive machine guns. In the corners of urban combat, a giant vehicle without a machine gun was like a blindfolded elephant. Enemy infantry could easily approach its blind spots and disable it with explosives, while the crew inside remained completely unaware. The helplessness of being isolated was described by Feldwebel Hans Becker of the Sturmpanzer Abteilung 216 during the battle at Ponry Station, Kursk Salient, in 1943. "We sat inside a thick steel box capable of crushing any house in front of us. Yet we trembled at the tiny figures darting past our vision slits. Without a machine gun, we felt like giants with our hands tied, praying that our accompanying infantry would protect us from the tank hunters hiding right next to our hull." So, what was the fate of these grizzly bears? Although powerful, they were a logistical nightmare. Only about 300 were produced due to high costs and low mechanical reliability. Gradually, their role was overshadowed and replaced by lighter, cheaper, and more flexible self-propelled guns. The Brummbär went down in history as a prime example of the German mindset, creating incredibly powerful weapons that were too complex and cumbersome to actually change the tide of the war. Elephant, Ferdinand, the flawed genius. If there ever was a prime example of German engineering being too smart for its own good, it is the Ferdinand, later renamed Elephant. This vehicle bore the name of its creator, Professor Ferdinand Porsche, the founder of the famous Porsche car company. On paper, it was an invincible fortress. Utilizing rejected chassis from the Tiger tank project, Porsche created a monster with frontal armor 200mm thick, impervious to any Allied gun at the time. Its long-barreled 80 mm gun could destroy enemy tanks from 3 kilometers away, far beyond the enemy's range. It even featured a highly advanced petrol-electric hybrid drive, half a century ahead of its time. But battlefield reality at the Kursk salient in 1943 was a disaster. The complex electric drive system frequently caught fire when climbing hills. But the most fatal and frankly ridiculous weakness was the initial version had absolutely no defensive machine gun. Professor Porsche was so confident in long-range power that he ignored close-quarters combat. The result? The most modern tank in the world turned into a sitting duck for Soviet infantry. Russian soldiers quickly realized they could simply hide in trenches, wait for the tank to pass, and then jump on top to throw Molotov cocktails into the engine vents. A multi-million-mark machine neutralized by weapons costing pennies. The despair of the crew trapped inside this sealed steel box was recorded by Lieutenant Karl Huber of the Heavy Tank Destroyer Battalion 65T4 during the Battle of Kursk in 1943. We could hear footsteps thumping right on the roof of our hull. The sound of hammers banging on the hatches felt like death calling our names. We had the most powerful gun in the world, yet we couldn't shoot the enemy standing just 1 meter of steel away from us. That helplessness was more terrifying than death itself. So, what was the fate of the Ferdinand? After the Kursk disaster, the survivors were urgently recalled. Hitler ordered them renamed elephant, and the very first thing engineers did was cut a hole in the front to add a machine gun, something that should have been there from the start. However, despite the fix, its 65-ton weight was too much for infrastructure. In Italy, most elephants weren't destroyed by the enemy, but scuttled by their own crews because they collapsed bridges or ran out of fuel and couldn't be towed back. Panzer VIII. Maus. The final delusional dream. We have reached the final name on our list, the ultimate symbol of Adolf Hitler's obsession with size. The Panzer II. Maus. An ironic name for the heaviest tank ever built in human history. In terms of specs, the Maus wasn't a vehicle, it was a mobile building. It weighed a staggering 188 tons, equivalent to a train with 3 fully loaded carriages. Its armor was unimaginably thick, 240 mm on the front, making it an immortal fortress against all firepower, even surviving near-miss bombs. Its 128 mm cannon could obliterate anything on the ground, but this sheer size was its death sentence. The fatal weakness of the Maus wasn't engineering, it was physics and infrastructure. No bridge in Europe at that time could support its 188-ton weight. To cross a river, it had to submerge and drive along the riverbed using a snorkel, an incredibly risky and time-consuming process. Furthermore, its fuel consumption was astronomical. 3,800 liters of gasoline just to travel 100 kilometers. At a time when Germany was starving for every drop of oil, feeding such a monster was impossible. The hopelessness of this project was felt most keenly by those who operated it. Major Horst Wagner, commander of the Kummersdorf Proving Ground in 1944, noted in a secret report, "When this beast started up, the ground shook as if there were an earthquake. But that sense of power vanished as soon as it moved. It sank deep into the mud, destroying every road it crossed. We weren't driving a tank. We were trying to move a concrete bunker. It is an engineering masterpiece, but a tactical disaster." So, what was the fate of this final boss? Tragically, the most powerful tank in history never fired a single shot in anger. As the Soviet Red Army approached the testing grounds in 1945, German engineers were forced to use explosives to scuttle the only 2 Maus prototypes because they couldn't move them and didn't want them captured. Later, the Soviets mated the hull of one to the turret of the other to create the only complete Maus in existence, which now sits coldly in the Kubinka Museum, a silent witness to the madness of ambition. The journey from the tiny, fragile Panzer the Worm to the massive, immobile Maus is a perfect microcosm of the German military's evolution during World War II. It began with flexibility and pragmatism and ended with obsession and delusional gigantism. History has proven a ruthless truth. The best weapon is not the biggest, the strongest, or the most expensive one. The best weapon is the most balanced, reliable, and suitable for battlefield reality, something the humble Panzer 38T or the Stugee 3 achieved far better than multi-million mark monsters like the Elephant or Maus. And what about you? Which tank's story impressed you the most today? Was it the ingenuity of the Panzer 38T or the tragedy of the Ferdinand? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss our next Secret Military Files. Thank you for joining Behind the Weapons. Goodbye and see you next time.